welcome everyone to the keynote talk for this conference entitled The Violence of Certitudes and Rethinking Solidarities Across Differences. And Swati and I discussed that we would like to keep this informal, and therefore you will tell us a few words about yourself before we get started. And then you will give us your talk, and then we open up for a conversation.
So thank you, Josephine. I think this is an incredible opportunity to talk to people that are not from my field and the usual crowd that we are just so used to talking to. And I think part of my talk is actually about challenging this idea of sameness. We have become so used to talking to our own, listening to our own, really not paying attention to how the idea of differences is being, destroyed in the world around us. And I will touch upon that a little bit. But just to introduce myself, I am here at the School of Global Studies. For some strange reason, they made me professor last year. So there you go, there I am, professor of peace and development. Oddly, I study violence and conflict. I don't do peace, but never mind. There is a title that I need to often refer to. How would I describe myself? I mean, I can tell you all about what I do, and my research is eclectic. I like to do many, many things, different things, and but I think all of this is driven by the fact that I call myself a curious citizen of the world. I'm incredibly curious, and I think in academia, it's a very humbling time to realize that we are all helpless actually in the world that we inhabit. There's a sense of helplessness. And I think as an academic, you inhabit that helpless space even more. Because what do you do? You're not teaching children. You're not nursing. You're not doing something that society might think is important. But at the same time, you are engaged with ideas, and you know that you're important in terms of your own, engagement with the world. And so I would say I'm curious, and I'm like all of us here. I'm trying to make sense of the messiness, the violence of the world that we inhabit. So I think I'll leave it there. But of course, I'll be happy to talk about so many other things that we have in common. So with this, once again, huge honor, responsibility to take you through these ideas, and thank you, Josephine, for entrusting me with this task. I just hope that I'm able to do justice to it. It's almost 9:10 in the night, and I'm not sure I'm very functional at this hour, but let's see how far we go with this. Um, so, looking at just the title of the conference, right, and the discussions that we've had, reimagining our worlds from below, how do we think about transnational conversations, and how do we conceptualize resistance, movements, transformations? I mean, some of the keywords that are important for now, here and now, we are talking about it. So, as we reimagine the world from below and think about solidarities, especially in these turbulent times, one thing is very clear, that we are living in times of extraordinary as well as normalized violence. And I will juxtapose those two together as we go along. So that's the moment that we are in. And this violence is visible not just in terms of the body counts that we are doing every day, whether it is Ukraine, Pakistan, Afghanistan, parts of Africa, and also the occasional violence in the US that flares up with the shootings, right? So let's not say that violence is out there, right? So we are living with this violence, which is not just the body count, but also the discursive certitudes that seem to dominate public life and also our private conversations, right? We are so sure. There is so much certitude, which I think is really so problematic. So these certitudes not only engender violence, but also foreclose opportunities of creating dialogic spaces and meaningful conversations through which we can historicize, contextualize, and build solidarities across differences, right? So we need to do that. And are we able to do that? So I would say that we're at a moment when we we are really not listening as much as we could. And I think we have all these ideas about the way the world functions, that any deviation from that status quo is making people uncomfortable, and that's where the talk is situated. So I want to talk about two things today. First, the certitude around violence and how problematic, exclusionary, and violent they can be. So basically, I want to play around the idea of certitudes around violence and the violence of certitudes. And second, I want to focus a little bit on the idea of difference, right? How do we navigate them and in creating transnational solidarities? What's missing, and how might we think through that? So, what are these certitudes that I'm talking about, right? This is important because for a very long time, we have researched, written on violence, protested against it, brainstormed ways of ending it. Various disciplinary frameworks have addressed the need to study violence, its origins, and what counts as violence. I think if I did a kind of conversation here, I think all of us have dealt with it in one form or the other. And for me, most of my adult life, I have not only grappled with it in terms of growing up in the 90s, in the India of 90s, but also since moving out, studying terrorism in the policy circles, and then moving on to feminist international relations, where I studied combatant women. For me, it has been very much part of my intellectual and emotional labor to really sort of unpack this concept, this idea of violence, and it still continues to fascinate me. But in these times when the presence of violence, I would argue, is both normalized and exceptionalized, and here I pose a question here: is it exceptionalizing the normal? Are we doing that, or are we normalizing the exceptional? And let's just stay with it for a bit when it comes to violence. So then the point is, have we stopped asking questions about the texture, the historical continuities, right? And this is where colonial legacies feature in. The location of violence, why is it that a certain geography or a culture or a location matters? Why is that, why is that a problem? What about the transformatory potential of violence, right? Which also some people have written about. Its ethical and moral dilemmas. Can you really have violence which actually transforms and does good? I think these are questions that continues to haunt us. The body count of violence, the injuries of violence, its coloniality, its discursive absences and silences, right? So those are some of the questions that I'd like to center here. And first, to draw attention to the fact that we have, in many sense, we have normalized and masculinized what and how we know of violence. And that's where I want to start. And I don't have answers to the questions I raise, so I hope to leave you with some observations. I'm interested in the exclusions and inclusions of violence in particular, when and what bodies may be outside or inserted within it, and how it is significantly gendered. Why is it important to talk about violence? And how it is related to the idea of where violence occurs, what counts as violence. Most importantly, who gets to speak about violence? Who is talking about it, where? And how can we reframe and reclaim the knowledge about violence? The whole idea of certitudes here. How can we reclaim this knowledge? How can we reframe? We know everything about violence. We have all these certitudes. To think about the pursuit of truth and justice for those who are injured, for those those injured and interrupted selves, which are demanding and desiring of healing and reparations and redemptions. It's not just the lives that we lose, but lives that are left behind in the form of survivors and those who are coping with these losses. What is it that we offer to them when we say that, we've understood everything about violence? What about reparations and justice? And are we able to talk about that in all contexts? So who gets to speak about violence and how in media, in academic spaces, and in different geographies is really critical. As Lily Ling, my very inspirational colleague, feminist and post-colonial IR scholar who went away too soon a couple of years ago, she wrote, "Those at the margins of world politics understand violence. They negotiate with it daily. Yet elites exploit violence to affix collective identities, forge a common political project, and subsume dissent. in this way, they deny opportunities for transformation in exchange for more violence. I'll leave you with that quote, but nowhere is this more visible than in, for example, the social media selective solidarities with grieving communities and those affected by violence. If we must ask ourselves what and who constitutes violence, we have to pay greater attention to how we talk about it and in whose interests. What doesn't make headlines in most cases is consigned to normalcy. And here I'm referring to Africa, to the Asias, consigned to the perpetually in conflict geographies and cultures. Violence is normalized. Of course, a bomb going off in Afghanistan, in Pakistan. Oh yeah, these things happen there. But let there be, a case of violence here, in somewhere in Europe, somewhere in Sweden, where I am. We've had a lot of riots in the last few, months here in Sweden, and that has been much talked about, right? Violence, an act of violence in America with the shooting, it immediately becomes news, right? And oddly enough, it becomes news even in the global south, not just in the global north, and that's where we need to sort of dismantle this myth of how certain geographies and cultures are the only places where violence occurs. It occurs everywhere, but what is exceptionalized and what is normalized? So that's the point. That's the first point regarding violence. Secondly, we like depersonalized, normalized gendered myths about violence because it is comforting, right? For a very long time, we liked the idea of man equals violence, woman equals peace, right? Till, of course, this was challenged extensively in feminist research. And it is arguable that mass violence since the 20th century has become more organized, impersonal, technically sophisticated, and psychologically framed by distance and denial. We are not connected to either the objects that kill or those whose lives we value less. We're not connected to what's actually happening on the ground, and technology is there to take care of the killings, right? This was most appropriately demonstrated in Hannah Arendt's analysis of Adolf Eichmann as an ordinary, dull bureaucrat who, in her words, was, in quotes, neither perverted nor sadistic, but terrifyingly normal. And I'm sure all of us are familiar with that Arendt, quote and with the work that I'm referring to. He acted without any motive other than to diligently advance his career in the Nazi bureaucracy. Eichmann was not an amoral monster, but she concluded in her study of the case. And the case, we know, Eichmann in Jerusalem, that some of us may have read it. It would have been so much more comforting to believe Eichmann was a monster, right? Arendt normalized the exceptional for us as a means to understand the context of violence and its individual perpetrators in a compassionate manner. She was, of course, criticized for it, but it is a cue that we have still not fully grasped as we continue to search for psychosocial monsters as perpetrators of violence and their hapless victims. And look at the discourse around Putin at the moment, right? Crazy guy, what is he up to? Actually, he's not crazy. This has been thought through, right? But I think we find comfort in these tropes that somebody who does it ought to be crazy. We kind of let go of context, let go of how we can understand it differently. For a very long time, for example, we did not think women could be perpetrators of violence, right? Till some of us undertook research to bust this myth. My own work is situated within that. Another example I can think of is the Delhi gang rape, in 2012, when that terrible gang rape happened in Delhi. There was a film by BBC, and I don't know if you watched it. It was called India's Daughters. The perpetrators who were jailed at that point of time and subsequently have been hanged, 4 of them, the perpetrators were interviewed in that film. And in my opinion, in a very unethical and non-transparent way. And this is a BBC documentary. I'm happy to critique it here because I know this is being recorded. But in some sense, they were interviewed and they were normalized as if, that is how Indian men navigate around issues of gender, sexuality, and women. So there were statements from one of the rapists who was charged of rape was interviewed. And the best thing is that you don't know what questions questions were asked. You don't know how they were engaged, but the idea was that, oh yeah, look what he's saying. And so there was a normalization going on, that this is what happens in India and this is what some Indian men do. But there was also this exceptionalizing as well, that this is, this man is such, this behavior is so deviant, and, this is so extraordinary. And, so it's how these dual processes go on. They were terrifyingly normalized, even as silences prevailed globally about the happenings in India, because that kind of thing just happens there. I mean, I've heard it often later that, oh, India is the rape capital of the world. Look what's happening. So how do we use these tropes, right? So normalizing the exceptional, or the politics of normalization itself, is comforting. It offers a way out of thinking that exceptionality can possibly enable impunity. It enables us to understand violence out there, like the DRC, like India, like Jamaica, like Afghanistan, Myanmar. This is very much obvious in my latest work with my colleague Camilla Orvella on reconsidering famines as mass violence. And this is a project that I'm doing because for a very long time I've been involved in studies of conflict and political violence. And suddenly it dawned upon us that, what about famines? How is that not violence, right? And I'll return to that in a bit. Consider that we have normalized and universalized violent populisms or right-wing regimes in different parts of the world. That's another example. More generally, there is this lamentation of the loss of religion, of good traditional values, of greatness of ancient cultures and civilizational heritage, and of status in the international society of states. A widely prevalent sense of emasculation has now resulted in reclaiming masculinity through what is termed as populism. I'm sure all of you are familiar with it, how this word is being used around. And this populism is one of a very violent kind. You remember Trump's Make America Great one. We have Modi in India, who's been constantly talking about Make in India. We have Imran Khan, who was, who had to resign recently, and Pakistan was in a bit of a turmoil, but he used to talk about New Pakistan. And of course, Xi Jinping in China talked about the Chinese dream. So, all these masculinist sort of leaders together, bound by this idea of, reclaiming the past towards a great future, and how that kind of has unleashed this era of populism and the kinds of exclusionary politics and the kinds of violence that it has unleashed. Erdogan, of course, New Turkey, he was also talking about it. They are all invocations. In all of these, there is an invocation of a glorious past and the march into a future where the bounties of globalization have been completely exhausted, replaced by inward-looking, xenophobic cultural nationalisms, unleashing gendered violence on their own people and beyond. And I think this is something to be thought through as we move further. But for now, let us continue to reflect on this certitude about normality, banality, this everydayness and quotidian that seems to dominate most aspects of violence and peace thinking. So my third point of reflection is that we continue to erase histories of people in this whole idea of normalization and exceptionalization. We continue to erase histories of people and societies, especially colonialism and imperialism, in order to justify violence as a contemporary affliction devoid of context, right? Of course, Afghanistan, crazy Taliban, which engages in this kind of violence. But Afghanistan has a really long history of, colonial interventions and how it has become what it has. But we want to easily let go of those contexts and those histories. I find it curious when people talk about India similarly, all this religious violence that I'm sure you're reading in the international press. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, there is a lot of, the society is, the fault lines are very visible. There's a lot of conflict. But at the same time, there is a history. There is a context within which this has emerged. For much of the global south, former colonies and now post-colonies, you cannot understand contemporary violence without its antecedents, without accounting for colonial continuities and historical legacies. I don't mean history here in the ordinary official disciplinary sense, right? No history. But histories as and I quote here Ashish Nandi, the past that lives and the past with which most people still live, at least in societies not dominated by the historical consciousness, are often dependent on shared and private memories that bypass the historical mode of reasoning. So, of course, irrespective of whether you can capture them in a disciplinary sense, there are people who live with a consciousness of the past, right? And that's the history that I'm talking about. Violence is not a product but a process in these societies where the violent histories of colonialism are gradually being erased out of analysis of the contemporary political. What we get is the case of, in some sense, justifying colonialism, that vile expression of white fragility and emasculation that masqueraded as a researched article, right? I don't know if you know of this, but Third World Quarterly a couple of years ago had published this piece, which was called The Case for Colonialism. And this scholar, in quotes, had argued that because Africa was unable to look after themselves, I mean, how good was colonialism? But it wasn't left to that. The analysis also extended to the fact that it was so good that it needs to be brought back, right? It needs to be brought back, those modes of governance. So that's something that we have to think about as well, how that coloniality of power, colonial legacies are being erased. Post-colonial scholars contend that we are still doing body counts of colonialism's violence. And in fact, this body count is so important that they even engage with scholars, post-structural and even feminist scholars, and argue that do we really need to focus on epistemic and discursive in the way that we do when there is a certain materiality of violence that we are not paying attention to. There are actual bodies to be counted rather than just erasures and epistemic silences. And that's a very interesting debate to be had because, of course, they speak to each other. You don't do the body counts because there is epistemic erasure, there is epistemic violence. But how important does epistemic violence become when we should be talking about those flesh and blood, the death and the erasure that we talk about? As Arendt would say, and I quote her, what a risky business to tell the truth on a factual level without theoretical and scholarly embroidery. And that's the conversation really among circles of people studying violence, that do we really need to sort of use this language, these esoteric theories and scholarly embroidery, when actually we should be telling the truth, which is at a very, very factual level? Can we consider erasures and silences as violence when we are still looking at injured, violated, exterminated, disappearing, mourning, lifeless, rotting, suffering bodies? And are bodily injuries only about blood and war, sudden deaths in the temporal scape, right? What about the slow starvation of bodies? And I was referring to you about famines, the project that I'm doing. How when you starve these bodies, and they don't just die because there's no food, there is human agency involved when people are starved and people have to die. What about deaths, displacement that occurs and the negation of the gendered self that occurs in geographies that matter less and through the legacies of colonial encounters? Look at Yemen, look at the war in Syria, look at Afghanistan, all of these places which have which have had hunger as such a critical aspect. Hunger deaths don't occur because there is a lack of food. Hunger deaths occur because somebody is being denied access to food. 43 Bengal famine, I think there is so much debate about it. And, if you start actually studying famines, it's such a fascinating way to engage in the idea of, Holodomor in Ukraine, I'm talking about Ukraine, and when you look at Ireland, very well commemorated. But there are so many other famines that we don't talk about. I was talking to you about 43 Bengal famine. It wasn't about food not being there. It wasn't about crop failure. It wasn't nature doing the job. It was food that was diverted by Winston Churchill, the big war hero, and not the mass killer as some people would analyze him as, who directed all of the food produced in Bengal to war efforts in Britain. That food was being used to keep things going in Europe, whereas 3 million, nearly 3 million people were starved in Bengal. So to think about some of these issues, and if that was mass violence, if that was political violence, what happens to reparations and the concept of justice, which are at the moment so limited to acts of terror and violence that occurs through wars, right? Nobody thinks of these kinds of violence, which are, of course, normalized. I mean, look at the pictures of the famine that you see. Aren't they of emaciated men and women in households, right? They are very household setting, almost as if the hunger crime happens only in households, that it is not a public crime like war, whereas it is. And so, the whole depictions of these famines in terms of very feminized bodies, the shame around it, I mean, we've done all of this research on this, and as have several people, that this idea of shame, the idea of what kind of stories about violence gets told, right? It's normalized that if you die in war, it's valor. What happens when you die in a famine, right? Who remembers you? Our project is also to do with remembrance. So we are mapping which countries, which famines have been commemorated, and whether those commemorations, memorialization, has it led to demand for reparations and justice. It's a very, very, and we call it slow violence. Of course, we are borrowing from other colleagues and other scholars who've done this work on slow violence in terms of climate and environment. But also, if you look at famines, you don't die immediately. Sometimes it can take a few weeks before hunger kills you, but hunger has killed people. And of course, then the fourth point about violence being, how it is a gendered colonial encounter. Violence of the colonies, for example, was highly gendered, as colonial masculinity took charge of women who needed saving from the emasculated men. And it was in this context that Ashish Nandi's 1983 book, which is one of the first books I read on postcoloniality, the postcolonial condition, and how it changed a lot of the way I thought about these things. The Intimate Enemy, Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism. This book highlighted the gendered impact of the colonial violence on both colonizer and colonized. And this was quite radical when he was arguing that colonialism doesn't just change the colonizers, the colonized, who are emasculated and who are feminized, but it also does something to the colonizer, right? It's a very intimate encounter, the intimate enemy. What do you do with that? And here he, of course, talked about, Nandi and other scholars have said that Gandhi did something very clever and remarkable. He embraced this idea of androgeneity and emasculation, which was thrust upon Indian society and Indian people by the colonial masters. And he used that and said, okay, you think I'm not good enough because I'm not masculine enough. I will embrace this emasculation. And I will challenge you with your own tool. With the way you emasculate me, that will be my strength. And I think there's a very interesting gender discourse around Gandhi in this. Today, of course, as you know, Gandhi is rejected in his own motherland, with the belief among large sections of the youth that Gandhi's emasculation was neither emulative nor desirable. I mean, if you talk to young men in India today on the streets and say, was Gandhi doing the right thing? Many of them would say that, no, he made India weak. He made us weak. He made us embrace a certain kind of weakness, whereas we should have been fighting. We should have been made, we should have been stronger. So it's a very interesting rejection of Gandhian ideology and Gandhian ideas, but quite interesting if you think about how it's unfolding in contemporary India. When American author Catherine Mayo, just to continue this conversation around how gendered and racialized this idea of colonial violence can be. Catherine Mayo published her book Mother India in 1927. Little would she have realized that the book's very dark and ominous portrayal of a colonized India would continue to find resonance in the understanding and representation of the post-colonial world in the 21st century. So after touring India for months, in which she was helped enormously by her British friends and hosts, Mayo wrote a scathing account of Indian masculinity, and she wrote about the widespread disease and ignorance, the archaic, the kind of regressive religious traditions and culture, and above all, the desperate conditions of Hindu women who could never find emancipation in their own society. Remember what Spivak told us, saving the brown women from the brown men. So clearly here was Catherine Mayo in the late 1920s making a case for how these women, these brown women, Hindu women, or perhaps even Muslim, had to be saved from their own men, and who better to do it than the British, right? Who could rule over a backward people who needed to be brought into modernity. But also how the colonial modernity was inevitable to rescue women from the constraints of tradition and patriarchy. And if you thought this argument is kind of really old, this trope occurs again and again. Go back to the speeches of George Bush when he was arguing that, we are going to promote democracy. Taliban is veils women. We are there for equal rights of women. We are going to unveil them. Of course, the savior mission continues, right? It's important to think through, and and she also talked about lack of gender rights and equality, and the inevitable nature of religious fault lines among people incapable of looking beyond their immediate interests, right? And some of what she wrote, and when I read these texts in the past and I think about contemporary politics or discourses, I'm like, you can almost superimpose them onto things. And I'm thinking of, for example, Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and I've written a lot of critiques about it. How conveniently this has become normalized within feminist circles that, there is an agenda and we have to protect these women out there, right? But there's no reflection on what they mean by gender equality. Many of these debates tells us that gender equality is what will make the world, peaceful. All violence will disappear. My question to you is that even an argument devoid of intersectionality? So, and who measures gender equality? Australian and UK-based, America-based feminists, Sweden-based feminists decide that this is gender equality, and Bangladesh or Algeria or Mali, they don't fall into that category, right? And so how do we deal with that, right? How do we kind of understand that in that way? So just to think about how these concepts are still very relevant. I actually traveled to the Caribbean a couple of years ago, and the whole story of indentured labor has really fascinated me. And it's interesting, the violence against the Indo-Caribbean women. I've been following that and reading so much more about it. The violence that traveled with them and never left them as they made lives in a foreign land. As cultural bearers, and this is something that feminists have always said, that women are cultural bearers of identity. They were brutalized for not upholding gender norms as prescribed in the epics and the myths. They were treated as fallen women. And domestic violence has been really a lot in the Caribbean. In Guyana, it was the most serious. It was considered a serious human rights violations. Most common form of violence is domestic violence, and justice was often denied because of the needs of indenture. Look at how colonialism works, the pernicious aspects of it. No work. If you didn't have work, it of course meant more violence, displacement and identity crisis, and more violence, and of course more violence, emigration and male insecurity, impunity, corruption, and above all the political economy of colonialism. All of these were intertwined. Men could not be punished. I mean, if you look at how indentured labor traveled, men could not be punished as they were needed on the plantations. So you couldn't, even if they beat up their wives, you didn't punish them because you needed them in the field, right? So it's okay for women to get beaten up. Battered women were labeled depraved and deserving of the beating by colonial magistrates. Any claims to asylum, as in the case of Indo-Trinidadian women, for example, was made in the language Western benefactors liked to hear. The battered brown women who needed saving from the brown men. So the layers of complexity gets lost. So on the one hand, you can't punish them. On the other hand, you think about justice in the language that you like to hear. Yeah, of course, these men, the savages, what do they know of treating their wives? Meanwhile, how violence is a vicious circle because these men themselves had come through a vicious cycle of violence and how they were treated and how they inflicted that violence on the women. So very, very kind of complex story to unfold. I want us to think about how the stories that I've just been talking about, all these narratives, they shatter our myths about the public-private realm and how we understand violence at the intersections of these domains or inside and outside them, right? The attention to violence in public discourse is enhanced by extensive 24/7 media coverage of war-affected landscape, injured and mutilated bodies, blood, gore, and displacement of people, all of which demonstrate the rupture of normalcy and exceptionality. What does not get as much media scholarly attention and does not make it to the public discourse are certain kinds of violence and mass atrocities where the death and suffering are neither a rupture of everyday, normalized as I said, nor a body count that can be routinely sensationalized and evoked in the nurturing of political constituencies and in demands for accountability. And I told you about, the slow, unesthetic, and ordinary deaths of ordinary lives in famines. Think about that. We even stopped reporting about famines in Yemen and in Syria. So that's something that I wanted to leave you with, violence. I quickly want to, I realize for the sake of time, I wanted to talk a little bit also about how, these questions that I pose about violence perhaps take us to the question about difference. Difference not just in terms of discourse, but difference as an embodied experience, right? Which has a direct bearing on how we understand and negotiate violence, right? So who is afraid of difference? Here I thought of, I remembered the Dalai Lama, who I follow his teachings, and very, very interesting, person in real life. I have heard him speak on one occasion in India, but otherwise also he's a delightful human being. So on one occasion a couple of years ago where he said, and I quote him, "I'm a Tibetan, I'm Buddhist, and I'm the Dalai Lama. But if I emphasize these differences, it sets me apart and raises barriers with other people. What we need to do is to pay more attention to the ways in which we are the same as other people." He said this somewhere, and the quote ends here. I picked it up from his Twitter at that point of time. This really got me thinking about the anxieties, the fear, and the discomfort with difference. Not that he was alluding to it in the same way, but the way he used difference. And he talked about how we are the same as other people. This desire to be the same, the desire of sameness, that worried me. And His Holiness is a delight to listen to read about, and there have been hardly any occasions when I've disagreed with his views. But on this occasion, I was really puzzled. What is this anxiety about difference? Why is the recognition of various aspects of his identity about emphasizing difference, right? He said, "I'm a Tibetan, I'm a Buddhist," and he said, "That makes me really different." Actually, what is the conflict here? How are these various aspects of his identity, if he mentions that, how does it make him, he didn't want to talk about it because it would make him different? What is this anxiety? What if he were a Buddhist and a Tibetan? How would that, bother you, Josephine, or I, when I want to listen to the Dalai Lama, right? Surely he can be all of those he mentions without any conflict and without raising barriers with other people. And moreover, why is difference within the self and with the other non-negotiable and an obstacle to feeling empathy and compassion? Why can't we live with differences, and why must we be the same as other people? Isn't real evolution about accepting and living with difference? Why does shared human experience have to negate differences or be even fearful of them? And this is a question that, trust me, has bothered me throughout my life and career and continues to bother me. Of course, these questions go beyond the Dalai Lama's tweet, as they reflect the larger public discourse and modes of being in contemporary times. We use easy labels and lazy categories to first establish differences and then to argue that it is impossible to work with or around them. This has enabled different forms of identity politics to crystallize into amorphous categories. Intersectionality is clearly missing, and multiple subjectivities have become extremely difficult to grasp. Consider the asylum seeker refugee debate in the world that is based on this fear of the other. Ironically, this fear is also inducing the urge to find sameness with those different others who have now become more acceptable than the refugees. And it's a very interesting idea of how we are so much comfortable, even when we see difference. The idea is always to say, oh, but they are like us. Oh, but they speak the same language. Oh, yeah, they may wear a headscarf or a turban, but ultimately we are the same people. This is what most liberal, most progressive people also say. And it always puzzles me. Why don't you just accept that people are different? Where is this anxiety about difference, right? Some differences have been mitigated through the search for sameness. Other differences are too difficult and just irreconcilable. And this is something that you see throughout that is happening. So inhabiting and performing complex human subjectivities has to be enabled in discourse and practice. We can start thinking about difference differently and creatively in our classrooms. Most of us are teachers here. We are associated with the universities. How do we differently and creatively think about difference in the classroom, in our families, in our communities, in the digital spaces that we occupy? To enable difference, in my view, is to eventually feel compassion and empathy. You cannot feel it unless you realize that this difference is important. And I remember a quote that Ashish Nandi made once at a conference, but I believe it comes from Latin America, one of the scholars there, hosting the difference, hosting the otherness of the other inside you, right? To accept that otherness, right? And the Dalai Lama, going back to him, this isn't meant to be a critical session on the Dalai Lama. I'm very, very fond of him. I have enormous respect for His Holiness. But what he said was, people take different, and this is what he said on another occasion, people take different roads seeking fulfillment and happiness. Just because they're not on your road doesn't mean they've gotten lost. So, he's also endorsing that it's okay. It's okay to be different. It's okay to have another path. So let's continue this conversation about difference. My final point, Josephine, I will close in just a couple of minutes, or perhaps one. Transnational solidarity, right, which is also the theme that I wanted to address. I see two or three things that are an obstacle right now. One is, I told you, this idea of difference and how we understand difference, how we negotiate it poorly, how we are invested in the idea of sameness. Second is this selective recognition of struggles. It links to my broader point that certain geographies, certain cultures are prone to violence. We don't need to talk about them. We don't need to unpack the violence there because they're always perpetually in this suspended state of violence. So this selective recognition of struggles, voices, and discursive locations has become a problem. So therefore, talk about violence in Ukraine, but of course, violence occurs in Mali, in Chad, and Central African Republic. That's very normal. That's okay. Violence cannot be one way to look at it. I'm just reminded of being in Rwanda once, and the news was playing, and it was saying that 3,000 people had died of malaria. 3,000 people had died of malaria within 3 months or something, the figures. And I was shocked because this wasn't even reported in the media here. But what was interesting is, come coronavirus, and we all start tracking the dead. How many died in America? How many in Germany? Oh my God, people are dying in these countries, not just in the global south. I mean, that became quite a spectacle. Whereas, of course, normally 3,000 people just dying, more people die of tuberculosis, of malaria in parts of the world that we don't even pay attention to. So thinking about diversity in that sense, thinking about selective recognition of struggles, and the point about how this continuous search for the authentic voice, right? Even when we want societies and cultures to be represented, certain kinds of politics to be represented, we are constantly looking for this authentic voice to mediate our understanding of the post-colonial world. And I think this is terribly disingenuous in these times, that, we want to see something authentic because, and this search for authenticity really insecures a lot of people. I'll come to that later. I did have a concept that I have been thinking through and wrestling with, the idea of empathetic critique. And how do we kind of think about this ethical dialogue between the subaltern and the hegemon, as Spivak would say? How do we create this space where, one can offer a critique, but one can also think about how that critique can come from a position of empathy. We can wrestle with it later. Finally, really here, we inhabit the era of certitudes, and certitudes are violent, as I have tried to show here, at least through some of the examples, I hope, that how the nature of violence has produced discursive certitudes that become obstacles in the pursuit of peace and justice. We are so, for example, as I said, no justice. People die in famines. That's not important. They don't need justice. So how we talk about violence also determines who gets to think about justice. And as I said, I've been deeply inspired by some of the writing that is coming from the Caribbean, and Deborah Thomas, anthropologist who's done a lot of work on Jamaica. I've started reading some of the things that she writes about, where she talks about violence in Jamaica as the complicated result of a structural history of colonialism and underdevelopment, not a cultural characteristic passed from one generation to the next, right? Which is how we see much of the colonized world, post-colonial world. What is needed to generate real justice, and I'm quoting her here, in other words, is a sustained conversation about history and about the place of that past in the present, in terms other than those of righteous blame and liberal guilt, right? And so forgiveness is only sometimes restorative, but never reparative. She reminds us, she argues that, forgiveness, it's restorative, but what does it actually, do reparations come? Do societies heal with that? Perhaps not. So with violence, we have to dig deep, and I'm quoting Deborah here, we have to dig deep, we have to hold people accountable, and as I say, we have to demand reparations for all this violence that we experience or have experienced. Nothing less will suffice. Let me end here with a poem, with a couplet, which I usually like to share. We are not reading any poetry or couplets anymore because we are inhabiting this very violent space. Gone are the pleasures of reading poetry. But this is Mirza Ghalib, very famous Persian and an Urdu poet from South Asia, extremely popular, born raised in Delhi, and fascinating. He's supposed to be the topmost Urdu and Persian poet. And just a couplet from him, which says, Ya Rab, wo na samjhe hain, na samjhenge meri baat, de aur dil unko, jo na de mujhko zuban aur. And I think I didn't have to give you this whole speech. I could have summed up everything in these two sentences, which actually mean that they have not, they in quotes, in your context, they have not and will not even consent to hear me out or even try to understand what I am saying. Give them more heart, O Lord, even if you grant me no voice. And I think I'll leave it here. Thank you, Josephine.
I do have a reflection, because what we're talking about almost, and specifically when you refer to the famine, or famines, we should say, and of course the contemporary ones of Yemen, where you hear that, because Yemen has often almost been described as a ghost famine, and it's almost as if there is this ghost of violence that is just inhabiting a whole area that is a ghost to us because we are not there, but it's clearly a harsh reality of those living in the situation. And another point that I had, and that is, I guess because I come from a legal scholarship too, is the idea of justice. Justice and also the idea of some kind of reparation. Then we again start discussing accountability, and accountability from where does it come from? Because if we then take a few steps back to discuss the historical context, that regardless of whether a local government, if we take, for example, Ethiopia, or clearly the Global North is going to point their finger at a local government or local governance somehow in relation to failures. However, everything happens in a historical context, and we know that these things are linked to post-colonial situations, right, or to colonial situations. And so how far up the chain do we go when we seek justice? And yeah, these are not necessarily questions, these are more reflections, because I'm thinking more broadly, like, so if we have these because clearly, even though these major famines are ghost famines to the global north while they are ongoing, later they become collective memories of the societies where they have happened. They become a part of the collective memory of a society, whether or not it becomes documented in, you know, the white histories of the world. And then if they are to seek justice somehow, where do people seek justice? Yeah. Do you have thoughts on this, Swati?
Yeah, I mean, there is, first of all, I want to say that thank you for listening. And I understand that there was a lot to process, but that's also because, you know, one doesn't get a captive audience, and one is filled with
We are just honored.
It's an honor. Yes, it's an honor.
You don't have to explain. I mean, I'm just so happy.
But really, I mean, I could have taken one theme and I could have talked about it, but for me, these are all my anxieties.
And they are intertwined.
And you have to put them across, because to me, the idea of a keynote is that we're all collectively thinking, you know, and just that somebody gets the responsibility to put it on the table, and we are all staring at it, because I know Henry, or I know Paddy, I know Likaya and Josephine, we are all struggling with the same issues in one way or the other. So I think my job was to just put it on the table. But I think you're right. I mean, the point that I'm making through this largely is, what gets to count as violence? And to me, that is the most frustrating question, because we have hyper visibilized certain kinds of conflicts because it suits our idea of, oh, what is a war, what is terrorism, you know, an act of terror somewhere, you know, yeah, okay, you know, there's radicalization, there is this, there's that, you know, the amount of resources and intellectual energy that goes into analyzing that, whereas some part of the world, 3 million people can be starved, but we don't need to talk about it because it's a kind of not public. And that's the point that we are making in our project, that killing people through hunger is a public violence. It's a public crime. It's mass violence. We are using the word violence. And some people questioned us and said, what about this idea of violence itself? I mean, how helpful is it? Actually, it goes back to the legal scholarship, because the way things are legally organized, right, Josephine, you would know, that actually brings in the idea of accountability, because the Geneva Convention says so. So our argument is that if you don't frame famines as, you know, just a crisis, a natural disaster, you know, crop failure, the moment you say there is human agency and it's an act of mass violence, you are actually asking to draw some accountability into it, to take some accountability, to identify. Those could be, that accountability could be of the structure, could be of the political system, could be of the government, could be in various conflicts. It's very many different things. I mean, if you ask me, in the case of 43 famine, 42-43 in Bengal, it was absolutely the British government that was accountable for taking resources from India, which was a colony, and diverting it to the war, and people got killed. Whereas when India became independent a few years later, you know, of course, the commemoration was, the pain of that famine was lived in novels and aesthetics and art. But what about justice? It just, I mean, today also people are bearing the brunt of it. The generations that whose you know, forefathers and foremothers died in that particular episode. And just think about it. Somebody, you know, shoots you. And this is an argument I had with a colleague recently, that, you know, what is a catalyst in a violent act? Like, I can die of a gunshot wound in a war and I'm dead, and that would count as violence. Whereas my suffering is manifold when I'm just like kind of denied food, you know, and I fast every now and then. And if you know the pang of hunger, when you don't have food, imagine for months, the children in Yemen, the people in Syria, in Afghanistan, they run the risk of hunger. What that does to humanity. But that wouldn't count. And so it's not just hunger, which I think is slow violence. It's also a kind of domestic violence. What is called domestic, it's not domestic. Firstly, the way in which gender violence occurs across the spectrum, how women and other genders are brutalized. I think that needs to be thought through. I think this over sort of masculinized acceptance of war and gore and blood and valor and honor, I think it's disturbing. Going back to the question of accountability, I think it's important in our hunger project for us to argue that there has to be accountability, which hasn't been. I mean, no conversations around violence actually talk about accountability except for war. Even if it is famine or whether it is loosely worded patriarchy when it comes to violence against women, we don't actually identify structures. I have a PhD student who's working on this famine project. He's from Ethiopia, and he's looking at the famine in the early 80s, Live Aid and all of that. And, he's studying it carefully. And his argument is that there was a government structure in place, that there had to be accountability. I mean, there's a discussion around that. So through this idea of shame, post-colonial governments themselves have put investigations of some of these mass violence out of the picture, because for them it's a matter of shame to admit that people died of hunger. And it still happens. I mean, even in independent India, people died of hunger, and government after government covered it, saying that we don't want the world to know that we were killing our own people with hunger. So, where does that lead us? And I think, so as I say, I'm only getting into this idea of accountability and mostly transitional justice, right? Justice that can actually be brought to people, and reparations. The reparation talk is a lot among people who, in India, for example, there's a lot of conversation that the British should pay us for what they did. British should pay us. But even within that discourse, people talk about, reparations in a vague way. Nobody says that you killed actually 3 million people right here. I mean, how many did Hitler kill? 6 million? If you look at the history of colonialism in the Indian subcontinent, and you're by all means go find the figures, at least 20 million people were starved to death at different points of time in the 200 years of colonial rule. So who thinks about justice there? So this disproportionate sort of hypervisibility of some of these kinds of also challenge my feminist friends, for example, who keep writing about sexual violence and war, and I'm thinking that war and peace, there is a continuum in many societies. Violence cascades, as my good colleague John Braithwaite and friend Bina DiCosta have written in the book, how violence cascades. One violence leads to another, and so in that context, there is no which society can we say is at complete peace and there is complete war in the other. I think they overlap in multiple ways, and therefore, the Delhi gang rape is a good example, Josephine. It did not occur in a war zone. I know, I'm sure that you all know what I'm referring to, that
Absolutely. Yeah.
brutal rape in Delhi. It was absolutely horrendous, but it occurred in a so-called urban space, in a peace capital city of the country, which is the peace area. It is not occurring in Kashmir or the Northeast, which are war zones, right? So this kind of hyper visibility, again, the exceptional idea that war produces this kind of exceptional sexual violence. Actually, no. Societies are producing a lot more violence, which are said to be at peace. Anyways, I think the whole idea is to play around, to think, to reorient our thinking on what is normalized. Ask ourselves that question: what is normalized and what is exceptionalized? To me, that is the critical question. I can't answer your question because you are the law person here, but the accountability question is a big one.
No, but I do think it's a very big one, and it's also because human rights in general are often debated to be vague philosophical guidance in applying some kind of judicial pathway. So what you end up with is having to prove the premise for its application. So if you in many cases, perhaps what the kind of work that you are doing now together with Fisea and the others in your project is showing the groundwork for for who is accountable, and of course it doesn't have to, because it doesn't have to be an individual or anything. It's enough that it's the state, right? Because it has to be the state if it's a human rights violation. And it has to be an expectation that you should have been able to have fulfilled by the state, which food, of course, is one of the many, right? But I have another question in relation to the focus on difference, because, I mean, clearly that is something that we are all noticing now. I'm a migration scholar, and we are all noticing right now extremely on a day-to-day basis in the European context, when we even just compare like the very recent events of the 2015-2016 migration situation and the present day Ukrainian migration situation, and how we just saw laws perform in a matter of minutes to resolve problems that we were told time and time again, this is an unresolvable issue. We don't have space, we don't have finances, we don't have the resources, we don't have the available staff, we don't have they made it sound like it was an impossibility to address the burden that we had then. And now within a couple of weeks the EU changes its laws, they kick in things that they haven't talked about since the Second World War, and everything is based on the fact that these people are the same. They're the same as us. And at the same time, I'm thinking, I mean, I would call it hyper-European. I've lived in a lot of European countries, and I just remember most of my childhood always people talking about how the Eastern Europeans are different. They're different. They're not like the Western Europeans. They're very different. And there, for a long time, there was the shadow of the Eastern Bloc and all this. So this leads me to talk about the temporalities of difference and how it seems to also be very much harnessed based on issues of race and race is perhaps enough, but xenophobia and this being afraid of something perhaps more different, and therefore an acceptance of a little bit of difference might be something more tolerable, or it makes a difference between empathy and tolerance, perhaps.
Yes. So basically mitigate difference as much as you can and create the space of sameness. And when you don't have it, then certain differences are created because it's negotiable. By the way, the first process is that first you create difference. In the first place, you reinstate that difference, and then you try to mitigate it, and then you bring sameness. And when you can't do it, then you're like, okay, certain differences are negotiable, but certain are non-negotiable. But difference also in a broad way in terms of ideas, and I don't think a lot of people appreciate what I say when I say this, but our high level of intolerance for ideas. And this I'm talking about even in progressive liberal circles where people are concerned, conscientious people, colleagues of mine, scholars, activists who are really concerned about the way of the world, speak anything that goes against their orientation, value system, their own ideas about the world. And you have a conflict there which is unresolvable. And I'm thinking that even if I said something, why can't you engage with me? Why do you have to label me and dismiss me? I think I'll give you an example. It's happening a lot in the classroom. I'll give you one really interesting example. I had a white Swedish student who came to me and said, Swati, I'm really troubled by the fact that every time I try to bring up the migration issue, I'm shut down by my classmates and by other lecturers. So I said, what do you mean? And he said to me, this 18-year-old kid, bachelor's first year kid, let me call him a kid, from somewhere like a village somewhere nearby in Sweden, comes and says, I believe that migration is really going to affect Sweden in the long run. So many foreigners have come in and they're going to take our jobs. So I sat him down and I said, why do you feel that? Do you have any statistics which says that, people are taking the job? No, what will happen to my future, blah, blah. And every time I articulate it, I'm just told that I'm a racist, xenophobe, which I'm not. I'm just concerned about how things... And I'm thinking to myself, why would anybody shut this 18-year-old up and call him a racist and a bigot and why are you talking about this? the fact that he comes to a person of color, one of the few persons of color in that department, and feels comfortable enough to tell me this, I looked at him and I said, you realize that I'm an economic migrant to this country too. I'm a migrant here, and you're talking to me about this. What you know? And I came in through a competitive job market. And we had a wonderful conversation. By the end of it, he was like, I think you make sense. I need to really process and think this. But instead of that, many people just jumped on him and said, oh, this is a very racist idea of, you have about the world. So I think this kind of lack of patience and intolerance of engaging with a point of view. And then we're like, oh, the world is divided into right wing and left wing or whatever. I think it's important to consider that people are struggling everywhere. And nowhere in history, I think, has no time in history has the muddled ideas, the messiness of ideas been more visible. I mean, as now. I think we are really, really messed up. We could elect an Obama in the US, and then we elected a Trump. The same public. The same public. What does that tell us about us? It doesn't tell us that people became bigoted overnight. I don't think so. I think we were struggling with all sorts of ideas, and then people voted, and then Trump came to power. Women voted for him. Despite what had happened, Black people also may have voted for him. So why don't we just pause and think instead of these kinds of labels that are loose? Right. So anyways, I think this is my pet project. How different can difference be? What differences can we accept, can we think is palatable, and what difference is completely non-negotiable? And I think that's really, really a problematic area of engagement. It worries me, and I also think of Ashish Nandi, my favorite scholar. I keep citing him, but really inspirational postcolonial scholar. He used to say about India, which again has become very intolerant towards difference. He would say that, look at India. I mean, there is no demon. There's no demon in the complete sense. If you look at the mythologies, and there's no God who's perfect. There's a demon in the God, and there's a God in the demon, and the messiness of living with that difference. And look at what we are doing to ourselves. And of course, he blames modernity for it. He says that this kind of Christian modernity that entered through colonialism was the big problem. And I'm willing to accept that as an argument.
I've been thinking about structural violence. And I think we have to propagate that. And it is related to accountability. So if we can conceptualize what are the different forms of structural violence and what are the outcomes of this, then we can identify accountability based on structures and systems. Therefore, we will have to change and transform those systems and structures. Now, where does personal accountability comes in, like leaders? So I agree with you. It is very complicated. And there are also systems of knowledge. How do we define violence? Relational, but there's also the structural and the power structures. So we need to begin thinking about violence not only in terms of you see blood, but of course that's easy to see. But how is hunger produced? And then there was the question that Josephine was saying. For example, when do we stop tracing back? We cannot identify that because history, the impact of history is on the structures, and unless we change that structure, historical impact of colonialism, for example, is going to be repeated year in and year out.
Anybody else who wants to say something first?
Well, it's very interesting. Let me come back to the point you were making, Parashar, how ideology start entering, and you were talking the example of the young person, the young student who came to you. But you know, here in North America, the notion of replacement ideology is not just individual, it's group, and it's powerful, have moved from the margin to the center, and the notion that racialized people are going to replace the white American, and in a less scale or a white Canadian, is in your face, and it's created difficulty. And I follow up what Ligaya was saying. There is the personal responsibility. For me, besides the leader, the individual leader, for me is how institution organize reality that justify those processes. I see, for instance, Josephine understanding the legal understanding, the human right understanding, the Convention on the Right of Protection of Refugees, and all the stuff are really important legal. For me, is how that legality move into the everyday living of people through institutional practices. That's the part that, for instance, the example that you mentioned, how I'm still stuck with Churchill because I have such a grief against that gentleman. It's how he managed through certain institutional practice that allow him to say, well, we need this food in Europe and forget about what the people are suffering over there. So it's very interesting how we can move on a different levels in the sense of the legal, the solidarity we can express, but at the same time, one of the previous sessions talk about the intersectional solidarity, how we can be different and at the same time engage an intersectional solidarity, which is something that you mentioned in different words, which I appreciate a lot. It's no new concept, but how you bring it to the now, I find it very helpful. I find it very, very, very helpful. Just comment.
No, but thank you, Henry, and thank you, Likaya. I think, yeah, I have the same questions. I don't have a response to you except to say that solidarity, the way we do solidarity and peace, I think it's very artificial. I don't know if I have, for lack of a, it's very facetious the way we use the idea of peace. That's why I never wanted to be a peace scholar. I believe in peace. I think the world should be peaceful. But the way peace scholarship within international relations played out, I think it really made me uncomfortable. Like this kind of, especially white men telling the rest of the world that this is how you do local peace. This is how you do everyday peace. They started appropriating all these terms and throwing at these societies perpetually in conflict and saying, never been to field work, never done enough work out there in the field, but will be comfortable to tell you what peace can mean in that context. Yeah. And I think it's so troubling. I mean, I once gave a talk on post-colonial ideas of peace, and I said, what you are talking about, people have talked about it for years. It's just the dynamics that you don't get, and you think peace is kind of transportable and peace is kind of, you can impose it. That's not how it'll work. So I'm just trying to say here that both peace and solidarity, as much as we love the word, like transnational solidarity sounds really good, it's hard work because we don't even have solidarity with our own selves. We are so conflicted. We are so conflicted. We don't even breathe, and we are not even harmony with our own selves. We don't even accept difference within ourselves, within our family. We are not compassionate within our own little spaces that we have, which is of the family, which is of the community. And here we are happy to talk about transnational solidarity. I mean, yes, it's aspirational. It's what I would like. But let's start with the basics of how we are treating people within our own circle, I mean, that was just one example. But what I mean is that this absolute, utter, horrendous disregard for difference. Become like me, then I will respect you. Wear clothes like me, so then I will think that you're not dangerous. The moment you look different, then I think it's a problem. I mean, and it's troubling. My social experiment was my bindi, so I'm from India. I wear this, I go everywhere. It wasn't, for a very long time, it was curious how it would make people curious and uncomfortable. It's also, it's called the red dot something gang, or there's a lot of phobia against this red dot that people wear. And I started wearing colored dots, blue and green, and and they were like, oh, but you're not wearing red. I'm like, because you don't understand. This is just a decorative piece of artwork that Indian women wear. It may or may not signify anything related to, ethnicity or religion. But I'm just saying it's a tiny example, similar to the headscarf. You wear the headscarf and there's so much anxiety around it. I mean, nobody asks questions about uh, what. And here, the interesting thing is that the bindi woman, the headscarf woman, is the exceptional one. Whereas what is normal is, the skirt or the trouser wearing white Western European woman. Everything else is, everything else is an aberration. I don't know. It's a really messed up world we live in at the moment.
In psychiatry and psychology, we have a great appreciation for the tolerance for ambiguity, right? The fact that ambivalence is an integrated part of the work. You are not going to feel great every time, and that is going to happen fine.
Yeah.
Right?
That's
I'm
fine.
sure in social work we have the same.
Yeah.
Because, or for example, people who work with substance abuse, or there are so many social problems that will never be fixed within the short span that we might be working with them, and therefore we have to develop some kind of tolerance for ambiguity, that there are small wins, that there are small things. And I wonder if perhaps this is something that can be harnessed when it comes to difference, that actually the ambiguities are the essence of the encounter with difference, that is what is of interest, and you see the small similarities maybe, but you also acknowledge and understand everything that will never be the same, and that's fine. Right? And I wonder if that's because maybe it is a personal project for every human, right? I am bringing it down to earth, and because the world is the way it is, and if we start in our communities and do that, it becomes a personal project for every human to accept difference as part of everyday life.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I don't have, as I said, I don't have answers. I've just been worried. I'm just concerned that why does it worry so much? In fact, I think it's boring. It's incredibly unintellectual to live in the world of sameness.
Yeah.
If we didn't have diversity in the genuine way, there would be no intellectual growth. We would make no evolutionary progress without difference. And this, I think, is in the last decade or so, this xenophobia, this scariness around differences. It's a narrative created, and regimes play to it as well. I've watched it in India. You saw that with Trump. You see that with everywhere, this idea that some people are not allowed in because they look and speak and behave different. It's really troubling. I see that in the classroom as a teacher. What students, how they construct the other, who is the other in the classroom, who is constructing whom. And I think we as teachers have a very, very great responsibility at this point of time. I have no faith in public intellectuals. I really don't. I think that they have all become private intellectuals. They are all funded from somewhere to say things that they do, whether the utterances are on Twitter or on Facebook or in the media. I mean, I have no faith. I think, to me, that is why I have a degree of respect left for my profession. As much as I'm cynical, as much as I think, what am I doing really? I get salary all through the pandemic. I didn't suffer. I got a salary. And what do? I'm a university lecturer. What does that even mean? Like, my job isn't, life doesn't depend on my job during the pandemic. It filled me with guilt. And I know that we're recording this. It filled me with guilt. I started feeling really depressed at some point, that I'm getting paid. Think about that, for doing nothing, for running some classes on Zoom. But the only way I could overcome this own contradiction within myself, was to tell myself how important the classroom space is and was during the pandemic. Right? This was the only hope that some people had to come out of the grief, to come out of the systems that they existed in, and to embrace, this space within the classroom to articulate their fear and their anxieties. And I think as teachers, we are really we are at a difficult time, but never before have our services been more important, I would say. Migrants are coming in and societies are changing, and there is everyday violence, and the way we treat people, there's so much going on in society. I had an Afghan student who actually was there for the graduation, and so I sat and chatted with him about how things were, how he missed during Ramadan, how he missed Afghanistan, and we chatted, and he said, "Yeah, I miss." I said, "What do you miss?" And he tells me, "I miss the noise," and because he's in Sweden, so I said, "What noise do you miss?" And he said, "The noise of bombs." So
The noise of
bombs
really?
that used to go off. So I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Because I used to talk to my mother or father at home, and suddenly a bomb went outside. A suicide bomber killed so many people." And he told me that I was used to it, and somehow that is the noise that I actually miss here in the quiet space of Sweden. So I said, "How would you cope with that violence, right? How would you cope with it?" And he said, "The only way you coped with it was realizing that you were not the only one." It left me absolutely tearful and speechless. This was what he said, that you coped with that kind of violence every day. You were watching bodies being torn apart by realizing that you are not alone. Your grief is not alone. And that is solidarity. That is solidarity. Not the very kind of forced top-down approach of building transnational solidarity. That was solidarity that spoke to me. Anyways, I just will leave you with that, Josephine. Yeah.
I guess if we're talking about constructing the world from below, it speaks to that, as we know in sociology, in the humanities, in a lot of social sciences, that the world is constructed in everyday life, in everyday spaces, and also that I think that transnational solidarity, or any form of solidarity, is not some project that is created elsewhere, like resistance or social, just like social movements are not created elsewhere and then dropped down and applied. As Austin Sarat used to say, that it's not a hidden project, that then is suddenly delivered. It's something that starts with a small group in a small place, and it builds and it builds. And thank you so much, Swati. I feel like we could keep talking, and it was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for taking the time, and particularly on short notice and in the world as it is. And thank you so much, Henry and Gaia and Patty and others who were here to listen. It will be a continued conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I wish you have a good night, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and look after each other.
Yeah. Absolutely. Take care of yourself.
Bye-bye. Bye. 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 Bye.